In this video, we are not talking about myths. We are talking about a system designed to defeat death itself, a forbidden book written to guide souls through the afterlife, a scientific ritual of mummification that preserved bodies for eternity, gods who judged the dead like criminals in a court of law, and a civilization that believed immortality was not a gift, but a skill you had to master. By the end of this story, you will understand why ancient Egypt did not fear death, and why most people today would never survive their afterlife. This is the true story of ancient Egypt's war against death. Death in ancient Egypt was not an ending, it was an invasion, a collapse, a violent separation of what made a human real. The Egyptians believed a person was not a single soul drifting upward into peace. A person was a fragile constellation, the Ka, the life force that needed offerings, the Ba, the personality that could move between worlds, the Ak, the transformed spirit that could become effective only after judgment, the Ren, the name that had to be remembered or it would die, and the Ib, the heart, because to them the heart carried truth, memory, and moral weight. If any part was lost, the entire existence shattered forever. No rebirth, no paradise, not even punishment, just erasure. That fear, real, practical, absolute, built the greatest death machine ever invented, a complete pipeline from corpse to eternity. It had manuals, it had chemistry, it had legal procedures, it had gods assigned like officials, it even had security systems, charms, seals, traps, hidden chambers, and spells written to function like locks. Ancient Egypt did not merely bury its dead, it processed them. And at the center of it stood a text we call today the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But that modern name is misleading, almost insulting. The Egyptians did not think of it as a book for the dead. They called it the Book of Coming Forth by Day, not because it was poetic, but because it was operational. It promised movement, return, breath, light, a way to walk out of the darkness of the underworld and re-enter the world of order. It did not begin as a book. It began as walls. In the late Old Kingdom, roughly the 24th and 23rd centuries BCE, sacred spells were carved inside royal pyramids, the pyramid texts. These were not stories. They were instructions, violent, cosmic, precise, meant to launch a king into the sky, merge him with the sun, protect him from serpents, gates, knives, and divine hostility. At that stage, immortality was a royal monopoly. If you were not the pharaoh, you were not guaranteed a map. But Egypt changed. Around the Middle Kingdom, roughly 21st, 17th centuries BCE, the spells expanded beyond kings. They appeared on coffins, coffin texts, opening the afterlife to high officials, nobles, and anyone wealthy enough to buy eternity in ink. And later, in the New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BCE, the spells moved to papyrus scrolls buried with the dead. This is what we usually mean by the Book of the Dead, a customizable set of chapters copied by scribes, chosen for a specific person's fears and needs, then rolled, tied, and placed beside their body. There was no single official edition. There were famous spells, common sequences, popular vignettes, yes, but each scroll was a tailored weapon. One person needed protection against decapitation. Another feared blindness, another feared forgetting their name, another feared the crocodiles of the Duat. So you bought the spell, you paid for it, you buried it, and you prayed you could recite it when your mouth was no longer flesh. Because Egypt's afterlife was not gentle, it was a hostile territory called the Duat, a realm of gates and lakes of fire, caverns, demons with knives, monstrous serpents, and guardians who demanded passwords. The dead did not drift into peace. They marched through checkpoints. This is why the Book of the Dead mattered. It was a passport, a weapon, and a legal defense rolled into one, but none of it worked if the body failed. And this is where Egypt became terrifyingly modern. Mummification was not simply spiritual. It was an applied science designed to stop decay. The Egyptians learned, by observation, by experiment, by brutal repetition, that moisture is the enemy. Rot is a chemistry problem. So they built a chemical solution. And over centuries they refined it into a procedure so standardized that we can still recognize its stages across time. The full classical process was often described as lasting 70 days. The exact timeline likely varied by period, budget, and region, but the ritual frame mattered. 70 days became the mythic duration of transformation, tied to Osirian resurrection and the cosmic rhythm of death and return. Inside that span, the most critical technical phase was dehydration with natron, often around 40 days in many reconstructions, because natron was the silent killer of bacteria. Natron, a natural salt mixture found in Egypt, stripped moisture from the body until the tissues could no longer support decay. The process began with purification. The body was washed. Then came the part that shocks modern minds, because the Egyptians were not sentimental about anatomy. The brain was removed, not because they were stupid, but because they believed the brain was not the seat of identity. The heart was. The brain was useless in the afterlife. So embalmers used a thin instrument, often described as a hooked tool, inserted through the nose to break up the brain matter and extract it. They did not treat it with reverence. They disposed of it. Then the abdomen was opened through an incision on the left side. The internal organs, liver, lungs, stomach, intestines, were removed, treated, and preserved. In many periods, these organs were placed in canopic jars protected by the four sons of Horus, Imseti, Hapi, Duamutef, Kebesenuef. Each jar lid took a divine head. Each organ had a guardian. Each guardian had a mother goddess watching. It was religion wrapped around biology. The heart, however, was usually left inside the chest, because the heart was not just an organ, it was evidence. The body cavity was then packed with natron, and the corpse was covered externally as well, laid out in a dry environment under the supervision of embalmers. Days passed, weeks passed. The human form became something else, lighter, tighter, preserved, transformed. After dehydration, the body was washed again and anointed with oils and resins. Stuffing might be used to restore shape. Linen, resin-soaked material, sometimes sawdust, because the dead needed to look human to remain human. And then came the wrapping. Layers and layers of linen bandages, sometimes hundreds of meters, applied with precision. This was not random. Each layer could carry spells. Each fold could hide an amulet. Each binding could be sealed with resin like glue, locking the body into a protective shell. Amulets were not decoration. They were technology. The Eye of Horus for healing and wholeness. The Djed pillar for stability. The Tayet knot of Isis for protection. Scarabs for rebirth, especially the heart scarab placed to control the heart's testimony. Because yes, the Egyptians feared their own heart. They feared it might betray them in the judgment hall. Which brings us to the darkest courtroom ever imagined. The Book of the Dead describes a moment that is more terrifying than any monster. The weighing of the heart. The dead are led by Anubis, jackal-headed god of embalming, guardian of the threshold, into the hall of Ma'at. There a scale stands. On one side, the heart. On the other, the feather of Ma'at, symbol of truth, balance, cosmic law. Thoth, god of writing and knowledge, records the outcome with cold precision. Osiris sits as Lord of the Dead, flanked by Isis and Nephthys. 42 judges are present, each representing a principle, each expecting a confession. It is not only a trial, it is an audit of existence. If the heart is lighter than the feather, the dead become true of voice, justified, able to pass. If the heart is heavier, burdened by wrongdoing, the heart is thrown to Ammit, the devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, built from Egypt's most feared predators. Ammit does not torture you. Ammit deletes you. The Egyptians did not fear hell, they feared non-being, so the dead had to speak. One of the most famous sections is often called the negative confession. The dead declare, before the judges, that they have not committed a long list of moral crimes, not stolen, not murdered, not lied, not defiled sacred places, not cheated measures, not caused tears, not polluted water, not abused power. The list varies. The meaning is consistent. You must prove you belong to order. And the Book of the Dead does something extraordinary. It tries to control the trial with language. Spells exist to keep the heart from testifying against its owner. Spells exist to open gates. Spells exist to repel serpents. Spells exist to ensure the name is remembered. This is not religion, as modern people understand it. This is a survival protocol. Now here is the secret that makes all of this even more shocking. The Egyptians did not build this system for a few decades. They sustained it for millennia. From the early dynastic period to the end of pharaonic religion, through political collapses, invasions, and dynastic changes, the core architecture of the afterlife remained recognizable. Egypt changed kings, it changed borders, it changed languages over time. But the obsession with securing death never weakened, it intensified. Because the Egyptian worldview was built on a brutal bargain. You could earn eternity, but you had to pay for it in preparation. That is why tombs were stocked like fortresses. Food, beer, tools, furniture, shabti figurines, small servant statues meant to work for the dead in the fields of the afterlife, because the dead still labored. The afterlife was not a vacation. It was a continuation of order. Even paradise had bureaucracy. That is why tomb walls were covered with scenes of agriculture, boats, offerings, and rituals. Not just art, instructions. Reality made permanent. That is why names were carved everywhere. Because if your name vanished, you vanished. To destroy a name was to murder someone twice. This is why damnatio-style erasures were so feared. This is why writing mattered. Egypt was a civilization that treated ink as a weapon against oblivion. And that is why Anubis became one of the most powerful gods in Egyptian imagination. He was not only a god of death, he was the god of the process that made death survivable. He guarded the embalmers, he sanctified the cuts, he oversaw the purity. In a sense, Anubis was the engineer of transition. Osiris ruled the outcome, but Anubis controlled the gate. Osiris himself, once a god associated with kingship and agriculture, became the ultimate symbol of resurrection. His myth, in which he is murdered, dismembered, restored, and made ruler of the dead, mirrors the logic of mummification. The body is broken, then rebuilt, then made eternal. Egyptian religion and Egyptian chemistry reflected each other like mirrors. And here comes the part that should change how you see ancient history. Egypt's spirituality was not separate from its technology. It was fused. They did not say, "We will preserve the body because it is beautiful." They said, "We will preserve the body because the soul must recognize it." Identity required a physical anchor. That is why masks existed, sometimes gilded, sometimes painted, sometimes simple, because the face had to remain a face. The dead needed to return to themselves. And this is why tomb robbery was not just theft, it was cosmic murder. To steal amulets, to burn papyrus, to shatter a coffin, to scatter bones was to sabotage the afterlife. It was to push a soul into the jaws of erasure. Egypt knew this. That is why curses exist, not because Egyptians were childish, but because social enforcement mattered. Fear was a security system. If a warning on a tomb made a robber hesitate, it saved a soul. So when you ask, why did they do all this? The answer is not simple. It is a chain of fear, belief, science, and power. Mummification preserved the body. The Book of the Dead armed the soul. The gods enforced the law. And the entire civilization, its art, architecture, economy, and politics, served the same ultimate goal: continuity beyond death. This is why Egypt built monuments that still stand when other civilizations turn to dust. Because Egypt was not building for one lifetime. Egypt was building for eternity. And the Book of the Dead, despite its modern name, was not a book of death. It was a book of defiance. A book that said, the darkness is real, the monsters are real, the judgment is real, and we have prepared anyway. If you want the raw truth, here it is. Ancient Egypt turned mortality into a system. They turned immortality into a procedure. And they turned the fear of nothingness into one of the greatest engines of culture ever created. That is why the mummies still exist. That is why the spells survive on papyrus and stone. That is why the names of Osiris and Anubis still echo across the world. Because Egypt didn't just believe in the afterlife. Egypt built it. And in the next part, we will go deeper into the most dangerous chapters of the Book of the Dead. Spells that were meant to defeat creatures, open gates, and force the universe itself to recognize the dead as eternal.